Hey everybody, welcome back to Chords of Curiosity. Today I've got Jake Klein and Brett Hall. What's up, you guys?
Good to see you again, Reed.
Oh, good to be here.
Want to give a quick intro, Jake?
My name is Jake. I'm a writer, a filmmaker, many other things. You can find me through my Substack, The Black Sheep. I'm on Twitter at Joseph J. Klein. I don't really know what to say about myself, but I hope that'll do.
Great. And your quick intro, Brett?
And I'm a promoter of the work of David Deutsch and Karl Popper, and basically, although I've tried to deny it, I guess I'm an epistemologist.
And I guess a connection between you two is the Enlightenment, how countries should be run. And one particular example of that is Israel. Like, I saw you on a panel at this conference in New York City. What was that called again?
Dissident Dialogues.
Dissident Dialogues. And you're very brave in going up there. And with who else was with you on that panel?
On my side, it was Brianna Joy Gray.
That was a
Konstantin Kisin was moderating, but was on the other side, and Eli Lake and Michael Moynihan. I would not say I was brave because I didn't necessarily think about like what I was in for too much. But I mean, I'm just glad to do anything that can help get what I think are good ideas out.
Yeah, I appreciated your very good faith arguments for what you were talking about. And how should we frame this conversation? I'm interested in Israel as a state, and is it something I should support? Because I'm very ignorant really about it. I just want to learn today and hear potential, arguments from both sides. Should I be pro-Zionism? That's another way to frame it. I have nothing against Jews, but this topic is very fraught in the culture right now, and I'm interested in hearing arguments around it.
Well, I would say to support Israel is a very broad question that can mean a lot of different things. So I would want to ask you a lot more specific questions about support in what way, regarding what. Now, should you support Zionism? For that, my answer would be a clear and unequivocal no. And I would assume a lot of your listeners, like knowing your work, were people that were very concerned about the rise of identity politics in this country, right? And if you have a problem with identity politics, I don't think you can consistently square that with a support for what is, by definition, the word for Jewish identity politics. I mean, that is what Zionism is the idea that there should be a Jewish ethnostate in historic Palestine. And, there's people that are living there now. I don't want any harm to come to those people. But what I don't want is an apartheid-like system in which there are two classes of people living under one government because of this idea that it must be a Jewish state. And I think that is very clearly what we're seeing and what came out of the ideology, where you have in Israel proper itself, Arabs have broadly equal rights. It is not perfect, but it is a state that is for Jews, which I just think is fundamentally unethical. But then the bigger problem is the occupation of the West Bank and before October 7th, the blockade in Gaza. Now there's a war under which Israel had military control of these territories, where the Jews that live in the West Bank have the full rights of Israeli citizenship, and the Palestinians that live in the West Bank are under a military dictatorship with an authoritarian military rule with no rights whatsoever. So, I think that is the result of Zionism, and that's wrong.
And by a country for Jews, does that mean two things simultaneously? The genetic lineage of a certain population, or just for a set of ideas, or both?
I would not say it's not quite either of those. So there is a religious definition of I would not call Israel a theocracy, although I think it does have religious roots that are often, people will say it was founded by atheists who are just ethnically Jewish. And I don't think people really fully appreciate like the religious ideas underlying that idea of ethnic Judaism. But I think you can help understand it if you look at what the Israeli state considers to be a Jew for immigration purposes, which is that you have to have a Jewish mother. And also that converts count as Jews. So there is a sort of unique definition of what counts as a Jew, which is it's not purely racial, but it's lineage, but you can convert into the lineage through certain steps.
Okay. Anything within that, Brett, you want to talk about?
Yeah, obviously it's true that in fact Israel is the Jewish state. But as we also know, if we were to look around the Middle East, there are various Islamic states as well. And those are theocracies. So take Iran, for example. The difference that I see with Israel, among many things, of course, the great diversity within Israel as well. So you do have Arab Muslims there in Israel living peacefully. In fact, when they're asked on the street, where would you prefer to live? They say they would like to stay in Israel. There's nowhere else in that region they'd like to be. There are blacks, whites, Asian people, gay people, straight people, trans people, the entire panoply of what we regard as a diverse society, such as you might find in the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, seems to be instantiated there in Israel. So although it's a Jewish state, a place for Jews to escape to, it isn't like what you might find in Iran, or Iraq, or Saudi Arabia, or Afghanistan, or name your ostensibly Muslim country. How many Jews will you find in those Muslim countries? Basically none. The diversity is very low. Okay, so in Iran we have Persians, in fact, who are a majority there, who aren't part of the theocracy or in support of the theocracy, but modulo that situation, isn't there a stark difference in terms of the virtue of this Jewish state when set against a whole bunch of other countries that are very hostile to Jews, to say the least?
Well, not exactly. So, well, I would, first of all, I mean, I agree with you entirely about the problems of Islamic theocracy. And I think having issues with Israel should not be taken as an endorsement of, Iran or Saudi Arabia or certainly Afghanistan or, whatever backwards country. What you say there about Arab Israelis, want to stay in Israel, I think you might be misreading into the reasons they say that a little bit, which is one is that they are Palestinians. They identify as Palestinians and they do not want to leave their homeland. And they were the ones that were lucky enough to be able to stay and not become refugees either in the neighboring Arab countries or forced from the land that became Israel proper into the West Bank and Gaza. So that's a big part of it. The Arab-Israeli community is very, very critical of Israel, but they also want to be a part, for the most part, they want to be a part of that democracy and have a role in what happens there. And I think that's great. Now, I don't think Israel really is a democracy. It's a quasi-democracy. But for the Arab Israelis, the ones that actually have citizenship, they have the ability to play a part, and that's good. The bigger problem is with the population in the West Bank and Gaza. Okay, so first of all, I also think you're getting certain things wrong about overstating the problem in the surrounding Arab countries. There is, I think, more diversity in a lot of those countries than you grant. Certainly Lebanon, north is a very diverse country, and that's come with enormous problems like, the Lebanese civil war. But there's, a sizable Christian population in Egypt. Iran actually does have a Jewish population. It's small, but that's one of the countries that, did not really after the rise of Zionism, like force out their Jews or anything like that. A lot of the countries actually that are alleged to have, forced out their Jews didn't really do it. There were both push and pull factors at the time. So I think the hatred of Jews in the Arab world, it's a problem and it's real, but it can also be kind of overstated and caricaturized. So, for example, Iraq. Iraq horribly, treated like certain specific Jews in the 1940s, right? And this was because of intercommunal tensions that arose over the rise of Zionism and this feeling that, people were traitors to, this other. There weren't, you also have to remember that this was a time before there were as strong national borders. That comes with Sykes-Picot in 1917, and we're like, 20, 30 years after this. So the whole land of what was once the Ottoman Empire, they all kind of see each other as brothers. And so to see, what was happening in Palestine and that this local population, that a share of it was supporting it, that raised intercommunal tensions and caused some things that absolutely should not have happened. I know there was like in Iraq, a trial of a Jewish businessman, which was very unfair and was wrongly convicted. However, it's also worth noting that, it's been historically uncovered that there was a bombing of an Iraqi synagogue shortly after Iraq allowed their Jewish population to move to Israel. And that bombing of an Iraqi synagogue was a false flag conducted by Israeli intelligence agents. And this was done at a time when this is historically documented by a very credible and serious historian named Avi Shleim, who's one of the most famous historians of Israeli history. So this was done at a time when Israel was really trying to build its population and get people to come to it to, and have an entrenched population as it was fighting wars and worried about, Arab countries. But they bombed a synagogue from another population, from an Iraqi Jewish population, never admitted that was them, and used that to scare far, far more of them to come to Israel than would otherwise have come. And so there were push and pull factors here. It's the same thing in Morocco. Morocco's king actually did not want to let the Jews leave for Israel because they were considered a very important part of Moroccan society. And then ultimately, I think Israel, I might be wrong about this, but I think they started like paying Morocco to let more Jews come. But Moroccan Jews were broadly well treated and did not. Many, after coming to Israel, regretted it and wanted to go back. And Israel took their passports and did not allow that. Now, we're far in the future from this, and the Mizrahi, the Arab Jewish community, is very well integrated there, and the issues that occurred in the past are far gone. But there's this, just again, a caricatured idea of the Arab world kicked out all of its Jews. And that's not exactly what happened. There were push and pull factors. Israel gave property that they confiscated from Palestinians to the immigrants. So there was reason also to go because, you would get a place to live. There were countries that kicked out its Jews. I think Jordan, maybe Egypt, and then I think controversially Algeria. They sort of did it in a more complicated way, but it was not the entire Arab world, and that is how it's talked about.
Okay, that was a lot there. Anything to pick up on?
Taking a step back, when we look around the world and we try and explain why are some nations flourishing and why are some nations not doing so well, or indeed some cultures are flourishing and some less so, one method of analysis comes down to this certain characteristic memes that tend to dominate in those societies. And so in broadly Western Enlightenment tradition societies, you have rational memes, which basically are ideas that have been arrived at through some kind of critical process. So science is emblematic of this, any scientist is able to throw up his particular theory about how the world works and everyone else can try and shoot it down. And The general version of that is, of course, free speech. Say whatever you like and people will criticise it, and this is how we make progress because we can rule out the worst ideas. So they're your rational memes. But in places where there's stagnation, where you don't tend to find the three key freedoms that I often talk about, which is free speech, the free vote, and free trade, that sort of fork are the methods of error correction in the various places, whether it be in trade, in speech, or in democracy. Where you don't have that, you tend to have a different kind of meme dominating, which is the anti-rational meme. The anti-rational meme is the meme that operates on people's minds and can spread throughout entire cultures, which disables people's critical faculties. And so you end up with Amazonian tribes, let's say, who haven't made much progress over the entirety of their existence, and they remain in a state of stagnation precisely because they seem not interested in trying to generate technology, develop science. They haven't yet reached an enlightenment. Much the same might be true also of deeply Islamist cultures as well. And so the Taliban is very much committed to a particular interpretation of the Holy Book, and so they want to keep things the same. Again and again and again, a child can be born, live and die, and very little has changed around them in terms of what kind of advancements might have occurred in that society, unless, you know, mobile phones might manage to get their way in. So what I see is an instantiation of the Enlightenment and of the critical memes of a dynamic society there in Israel. So I see it as part of a continuum of our Enlightenment traditions, along with the United Kingdom, Australia, you know, the Anglosphere broadly, the West broadly. And it's for that reason that I think that it's incumbent upon people in those Enlightenment traditions to very much support Israel because it is an outpost of the Enlightenment. It may very well be Jewish, it may very well have particular problems, much like the Ukraine, for example, which is a different story altogether. However, these are, in the battle of ideas, instances of the Enlightenment up against forces that are very much anti-Enlightenment.
Let me ask this clarifying question. If you had to put countries on a scale from 0 to 10 in terms of how much, you know, Enlightenment values of those three things, which country is the best right now, just to calibrate the 10?
United States.
Okay. If the US is a 10, where would be Saudi Arabia?
2, 3?
And where would be Israel?
9.
Where would you put Israel?
5.
A 5.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's a difference to potentially talk about.
So again, you and I would, I think, share all the same criticisms of Islamic theocracy. So I don't want to challenge you even a little bit there or with the problems with those societies. Where I do very much disagree with you is the idea that Israel is an instantiation of Enlightenment values and the idea that, you know, therefore we should support it. This is very similar to the argument that Ayn Rand gave for why we should support Israel. I'm a huge fan of Ayn Rand. She's a massive intellectual influence on me, maybe one of the largest. I worked at the Ayn Rand Institute for a very short period of time when I was just out of college. And what she said is, just like you said, is you know, the Arabs, they're not building things, they have a backwards culture, but Israel, it's developing, you know, they're building, they're growing trees and building buildings and all this stuff. And when it's barbarism versus civilization, you need to support civilization. Now, I think if you look at like the UAE or Qatar, also Saudi, I mean, they're building, you know, certainly Qatar, I hear, is just a good place to live for most people. And you know, I've heard wonderful things from the people I know that have visited. But I don't need to, I don't know that much about Qatar. But I do know a lot about Israel. And I think when Ayn Rand and people thinking in that general school of thought say those kinds of things, it directly contradicts other principles that are way more core to their philosophy. So Ayn Rand is a wonderful theorist of property rights and, you know, the idea of self-ownership and the ownership of what one develops and all that. That, for me, as a libertarian, is core to the Enlightenment. That's the biggest thing that I see out of it is individual rights being property rights, essentially. You own yourself and you own the fruits of your labor. And so if you don't protect that, you don't protect the Enlightenment as far as I'm concerned. And that's the opposite of the story of Israel. The story of Israel is that a population was in large part expelled in order to maintain a Jewish ethnic majority, that the war that broke out in 48 was the result of intercommunal tensions, and there's blame on both sides to go around. I don't want to say it's on one side, although I do think that the initial spark was the Zionist project, the idea of we're going to build a Jewish ethnostate here, we're coming to immigrate here, and then that sparked a reaction, and then reactions go back and forth, and everybody shares blame. But the biggest thing that you see is this lack of treatment of people as individuals, but treatment of people based on their group identity. So when the war in 48 breaks out, that's just a little thing of, you know, a Jewish terrorist group, you know, bombs an Arab thing, and then Arabs bomb a Jewish thing that's not even connected to the people that did the original crime. And then the reaction to that from the Jewish side is we're going to bomb an Arab thing that's not related to the people that did that reaction, right? Because they just see each other as groups. And that's not individualism, that's not Enlightenment thinking. And that escalates up into the point where you know, have a full civil war and then have a, you know, multiple country war where other countries come in to try to defend the Palestinian population. And so a large part of the Palestinian population gets expelled by force. There are massacres. There's massacres from both sides, but there were far more by the Zionist forces against the Palestinians than the other way around. And after most wars in modern times, when the war ends, civilians are allowed back. There's a couple exceptions to that, but not a lot, and this is the big one. That's why we hear about the right of return being such a big deal in the peace process, is civilians were kicked out. They are supposed to be allowed home after a war. The same UN that voted to give Israel a state in Palestine, now that was not at all their right to do, but if you're going to accept the legal authority of that, then you need to accept that immediately after the war, they voted for the refugees to be allowed back, and that has never been followed since. May I just finish one more part of this? So I'm sorry, I know I'm going on a long time, but then Israel confiscates the property of the expelled population. They pass a series of absentee property laws and reassign that land to Jewish owners. So they engaged in theft on ethnic grounds. That is not an Enlightenment principle. And to this day, there are many, many Palestinians that own the keys to the homes that are stolen. It's a major symbol of the Palestinian resistance. And they can point exactly on a map to the property that would have been theirs, that was their parents or grandparents. And in some cases, those grandparents are still alive. You know, I have a person in my family who is in her 90s and was in Israel in 1948. You know, those people are still alive. This is not like, you know, the Native Americans where we're talking like 300 years ago. This is in the lifetime of people that are still around and their direct children and grandchildren who can point to exactly the property that's theirs and has been stolen and has not been returned. And that is not an Enlightenment value until that's changed. It's not, apartheid is not an Enlightenment value. Ruling people with a military government since 1967 and not allowing them to vote, constant search and seizure, arresting them without needing a warrant or without charge or anything, forcing them to pass checkpoints to go to their own cities, not just to cross into Israel. A couple of them can do that for work, but to cross between their own cities. That is unrecognizable to the Enlightenment that I'm familiar with.
Okay. So interesting you mention it's not like the American Indian case, which is sort of similar to the Australian Indigenous case as well, where there are people today, and it happens on the regular, who are Indigenous, who say, this land was never ceded. Australia isn't actually a legitimate place. It should be handed back to the Indigenous people, who should rule it via some mechanism which isn't in accord with, Western democracy or the Westminster system, whatever you like. Now, the difference that you seem to say between that situation, which seems to me prima facie illegitimate for us, Europeans, or to the extant people who are there now, to hand back the land of Australia to Indigenous people, is that, well, there's no one alive today who is guilty of stealing land, and no one alive today who is actually been dispossessed. We are many generations down from that particular time.
Yes.
So you're saying it's by virtue of time passing that we go from a state where you're saying Israel is in some sense illegitimate and property should be handed back to these people because some small number are still alive, or the grandchildren of these people can point to a place.
So my theory of property rights, which is based on the work of Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard, would basically be that if you can point to, if you have a clear chain of property title, then that's yours for as long as it goes. If you could go back 10 generations and really be able to say concretely, like, this plot of land, was mine directly. If you can really prove that, then to fix that property right would be just. Now, when we talk about things like, say, reparations for slavery, you don't really have a lot of people that can point to things like that anymore. And at that point, if you were to try to correct the wrong from back then, well, you're not going to correct it. You're just going to commit a different wrong unless you can say exactly, this specific person has X, and were it not for the violation of property rights, I would have X instead. What we're talking about instead is, like, again, in the American reparations context, like, we're going to tax all white people and give it to black people. Now, that's ridiculous on so many levels. Like, number one, my family didn't come here until well after slavery was abolished. But then also, even at slavery times, not most people, white people, owned slaves. What is the amount of the remuneration that you need to be dealing with? You have to be able to know all those sorts of things. And this is a situation where we know exactly those things. And that is, what I think makes it very different.
Would you not also say, or grant, perhaps you won't, that there are historic documents stretching back some 2 millennia that say Jewish people were in this land, Jerusalem, for example?
There's no such thing as collective property. Individuals own property. And that's, an important part of the Enlightenment. Also, the question of who is the Jews of 2,000 years ago is a very important question. If you look at genetic studies, the Ashkenazi Jewish population that was responsible for the creation of the State of Israel, they are about 30% of Levantine DNA. The rest is mostly European from various parts. The Palestinian population has not full, they're not just the ancient Judeans all intermarrying with each other, and they're the Palestinians now. There was intermixture with the Arab population as well. But they have a greater share of their DNA from that population than the Ashkenazi Jews do, and the Sephardi Jews and the Mizrahi Jews. I think it varies within group, but some are actually, very much, entitled historically to that land. But that still wouldn't give somebody a property claim over, we're in a house right now, the specific land boundaries of this house. And that's what really matters. Like, you can't say a people own an entire country and, we're going to give an entire country to a people and violate everything else. There's individual property owners who have individual rights. God, there's one other thing I wanted to say about this that was important, but it's escaping me. I'll have to leave it there.
Yeah, what Brett was saying is my general intuition too, is Judaism predates Islam. I don't know the relationship between Islam and Palestine.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I remember now. So, the Palestinian population, again, given that they have that origin, Well, they're the Judeans that then went and converted to Christianity and converted to Islam over time. Now, does the fact that they converted make them somehow less the proper owners of plots of land in that area than people that just maintained the original religion? Like, what does that have to do with anything? Like, we're all atheists here, right? If you were to say that, the Roman Empire or Italy is Christian territory, and we're going to dispossess the atheist Italians who have ancestors going back there many, many years, who once upon a time were Christian but now are atheists, I think we would recognize that as ridiculous. And I think that's the same kind of logic that we hear when we say, it's the Jews' land because there was a Jewish country there 2,000 years ago.
Now, there's been extirpation, so to speak, in both directions. Would you grant, so for example, the West Bank, Palestine, broadly, Gaza, there are no Jews there now, but there were? Not
a lot. And yes, I would grant that, yeah, so insofar as there were Jewish immigrants there in the British Mandatory period who had a plot of legitimately owned land there that was expropriated in 1948. Yes, I would agree that should be remunerated. However, that there's drastically less of that than there is the other way around.
Interesting you said remunerated there. So you mean compensation should be paid, or that Jews, if possible, should be allowed to return to areas in the West Bank?
So what I would say is that that's ultimately up to the person who's owed that, right? You can choose to accept compensation, but ultimately things are subjectively valued. If that's yours and you don't want to accept, I didn't mean remuneration like that, but just since you say it, you could choose to accept compensation, that would wipe away the debt and that would be fine. You might also say, no, I don't want to accept that. This thing is priceless to me. It's so important to me for whatever reason. And yes, I want it back. And in those cases, yeah. And there were some of the Arab countries, people will often kick this back to me of, well, yeah, but what about the Jews that were expropriated of their property in the Arab countries at that time as well? And I'll say the same thing. I'm perfectly consistent here. Yes, if there's anyone that wants to go back and can point to their specific property and has documents and can prove it, that should be made right, 100% in both directions.
But when you have a right like that, let's say, there's also the practicality that it would be clearly, it would seem to me, untenable, even if a Jewish person today, perhaps they're in Israel now, can point to a place in Gaza and say, I can prove my historic connection to that, my grandfather owned that plot of land. It would be absolutely untenable for that person to return there. In fact, the settlements have all been withdrawn, so there are no Jews there because Israel actually took out their own settlers in those particular areas who may very well have claimed that we have a legitimate right to this place. But the reverse wouldn't so much be true. I would suggest that so long as the person can be checked for not being an Islamist terrorist or is going to cause some mischief, that they would be welcomed back into Israel.
Do you think that?
Yeah,
that's totally wrong.
Because there are, as I say, Arab Muslims already there in Israel.
That is wildly incorrect, and I don't know how you came to that idea. Israel very much wants to control its Arab population's size and does not want it to grow. It is very worried about the population demographic, and the main thing that being a Jewish state means for Israel is maintaining a Jewish demographic majority. That is absolutely not true. Remember, there's Palestinian Christians. Palestinian Christians are treated identically to Palestinian Muslims. They are not allowed to go become Israelis. There's exceptions in land that's been annexed. So for example, in East Jerusalem, like Israel says that's theirs, and they've offered, since they're governing it as part of, they're saying they're going to keep it permanently no matter what. They don't per se say that about the West Bank, even though Netanyahu, and that's their goal. And they'll state that, but they won't state it like in policy per se for international legitimacy. They have to keep saying that, I guess there could be a Palestinian state there and we'll make peace one day or something. But so in East Jerusalem, they've been offered citizenship, but the rest of that, no, absolutely not. Not a single person. That is, Israel has no interest in that. They have the opposite interest of that, and if that's the impression that you have of what's going on, I think you might have a very deep misunderstanding of what Israel's primary agenda is in terms of its the importance of a Jewish majority to it.
What is Egypt's agenda then? They have a wall that is equally high and strong and tall as anything that cordons off Israel from, let's say...
U.S. support. The U.S. pays enormous amounts of money to Egypt to maintain peace with Israel, and also part of what we have bought with our unparalleled financial and military aid to Israel is that they also maintain peace with Egypt. So these are all kind of branches of the U.S. empire, broadly conceived. So they work together for that reason.
Is there a danger when looking at conflicts around the world, this one in particular, of always looking at it through the lens of, problem. What did the United States do to cause this particular problem? As if there's not some independent reasons.
I understand that, but I think that there is, and I'll even grant this amongst libertarians, like a desire to blame the U.S. for everything that's wrong in the world. I personally don't think that, but I see that a lot. This is not an example of that. Like we pay billions of dollars to Egypt a year, and it's to keep them aligned with what we want. Like that money is not for nothing. So in this specific example, I don't think we can.
So to put a really fine point on it, you're saying that the United States has an interest in giving money to Egypt with the string attached that don't allow the Palestinians out.
I'm not saying that that's the particular string, but what I'm saying is that the string broadly conceived is that you maintain peace with Israel, do what is necessary to maintain peace with Israel. We are trying to keep, security and stability along U.S.-aligned nations, and that is one facet of that.
Wouldn't Israel want there to be no wall between Palestine and Egypt?
No, quite the opposite for a bunch of different reasons. So the one that they'll state, and it's true, but it's not the only reason, is that they want to prevent smuggling of weapons. Okay. So they don't want it for that reason. The other reason is, and nobody should mistake the blockade on Gaza before the war as being just about that, because they were blocking things like cookies and things that have no possible military use. And this is because they wanted to put pressure on the civilian population in Gaza to basically do what they want. And, the thing is, it's also confused by different Israeli government factions wanting different things at different times, right? So Netanyahu and Bezalel Smotrich, one of the ministers right now, are both on record saying that Hamas is an asset because Hamas's rule in Gaza gives us an excuse to not make peace with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, that we can point to these radicals here. So on the one hand, they want to keep Hamas in power, but at the same time, they want to really crack down, control the population, and coerce them into doing things that Israel wants. And this is illegal under international law, by the way. This is called collective punishment. Like you're not allowed to do that. I mean, the entire occupation is illegal under international law. It's not their land. You're not allowed to conduct permanent military occupations. You're not allowed, especially, to move in your civilian population into those areas. As you correctly noted, Israel withdrew those from Gaza, but they did not, and they only keep growing much faster in the West Bank. And by the way, one of the reasons that it was withdrawn from Gaza, according to an aide of Ariel Sharon, who that was done under, was because Israel doesn't want Gaza quite as much. It's only the really more extreme settlers that are like super attached to Gaza. But they do want the West Bank very much. And that they could look magnanimous and look like they're doing something big for peace, but then really solidify in the West Bank, where they're much more interested in keeping control of that.
Okay. And you basically said, all of that stuff is about before the war. But now that there is a war, and Hamas was the government or still is the government in Gaza, and they seem to be losing or have lost the war. How would you characterize the status of the war right now, in terms of like who?
Well, I've come around to accepting it being called a genocide. I was not there at first, but I think that that's part of it. I think that the Israeli population is just fed up and wants the Palestinians gone, finally. That there's always been a large share of the Israeli population that thinks that, but after October 7th, that grew substantially. And that's, the Trump plan, to ethnically cleanse Gaza, that they're going to leave and they're not going to be allowed back. Netanyahu has endorsed that and says that that's an important goal of his. So I think that it is ethnic cleansing. And I also think that it's about Netanyahu remaining in power. He has at least 2 members of his cabinet who will resign if the war ends, and that is enough to force him out of power. He is on trial for corruption in Israel, for financial corruption, accepting bribes. So if the war ends, then he will lose power. He'll have to face his trial in a more serious way than he is during the war while in power. And so I think there's personal motives there. The United States assessment, as has been leaked to media repeatedly in various forms, is that, and we've heard Steve Witkoff say this publicly to the parents of the hostages, is that the U.S. doesn't see a military reason for the continuation of this war, that there's nothing more that can be accomplished except for these horrible ends, or if they're really going to do the Trump plan of ethnic cleansing.
You must have had pushback on this. I'll be interested to see where you go. If indeed it's a genocidal ethnic cleansing, why are the Israelis so terribly incompetent at performing this genocide? All the figures that I can find suggest that ever since October 7, the population of Gaza has only increased during that time period. Now,
I've seen that number challenged.
Okay, even if we were to grant that it hasn't increased, it's maybe remained steady or it's gone down a little, any of those options are not like an asymptotic fall towards zero population, which is what typically happens under a genocide.
No, that's not correct.
But we also know that if a genocide was to be planned, it could have been done because of the power of the IDF.
Yeah. Well, if what you mean by genocide is the Holocaust, and we're just going to systematically mass murder all of them, no, I don't think what's happening in Gaza is
or even
Holocaust.
The Hutus and the Tutsis, let's say, in Rwanda.
Yeah, well, you might look at other genocides like the Rohingya genocide and other ones that meet the fact pattern of what we're seeing here in Gaza more. When I say genocide, I don't mean to say that it's the Holocaust. What I do mean is that it's the intentional destruction of a people. And so it is, indiscriminately starving and killing them. Not all of them, but it is also trying to ethnically cleanse them and force them to leave, right? So to destroy the Palestinian population that way. So that's what I mean when I say genocide, which is very in line with certain other genocides, but not all other genocides.
The starving them argument is interesting as well, because there's 2 responses to that. One is there is some food getting in would be the first thing. But the second thing is that, as Douglas Murray has pointed out, when in human history have combatants on one side been required to supply food and resources to their enemies
They
on the other
don't.
side?
So that Douglas Murray is just completely wrong. I mean, about basically everything about this issue, but that is really a particularly off one. So first of all, under international law, you are required to allow humanitarian aid in. I'm not sure if you're required to provide that humanitarian aid, but nobody's really asking Israel for that. What they're asking is for them to let the other countries that want to provide aid to facilitate its entrance. That's all. Not to pay for all the food and pay for all the medicine themselves. There's more than enough international will around the world to provide that. But they are not letting that in. And the reason that they're not letting it in is because it's a part of a military strategy. And there's many quotes from Israeli military leaders validating that, that they want to put Gazans on a diet, right? And what this is, again, another thing that's illegal in international law is, I think I said it already in a different context, but collective punishment, right? That we are going to punish all of Gazans to try to force the civilians to become military assets for us and overthrow Hamas. You're not allowed to do that, and that's a particularly evil thing to do. I mean, imagine here if there was a country that had a huge problem with Trump, and so they said, we're going to starve all Americans unless they ransack the White House and throw out Trump. And you're not American, but we didn't necessarily. I did vote for Trump, but let's imagine I didn't vote for Trump. That's not my fault. You're gonna do that to me? I mean, that's evil and rightfully illegal.
What if the humanitarian aid that, if they were in that situation, people sent to America, and like 90% of it went to MAGA people or Trump's administration? Is that something analogous happening with Hamas stealing humanitarian aid for their own use? Or how much do you think Hamas would steal?
There's not really a lot of documented evidence that Hamas actually is stealing huge amounts of aid or really much of any aid. That is an allegation that's been made. It's totally plausible, and I see no reason to discount that they probably are stealing some of the aid, but there's so much aid that people want to let in. And this is one of those things where it's like, to starve out Hamas means starving the entire Gazan population. That's not how other countries fight wars. It's not how the US fights wars. And it's just deeply unethical. There's so many other tools militarily and in terms of strike to go after Hamas. And that is collective punishment, and it's just not right.
Does the existence of the tunnel infrastructure apply as like a contextual thing in this situation, where Israel, if it had the capacity to end the war quickly by targeted assassinations of Hamas leadership or whatever?
It's done a lot of those.
That would be the ideal situation for me. And all the humanitarian aid got to the civilians, but they seem to be defending themselves against civilians and within civilians. So it's like, is this ethnic cleansing, is this a military strategy that is the only thing left at this point, since they can't do targeted strikes because of the risk of killing civilians?
Israel's not going to win through military means. They're not going to get rid of Hamas that way. And so first of all, just in terms of targeted strikes, Israel's done many targeted strikes. They've also very much not done targeted strikes very intentionally and knowingly, which is one of the reasons that I say overwhelmingly the war has been indiscriminate. So for example, they had a program called Where's Daddy, where they would wait for militants to return home and bomb them while they're with their family. And they would use 2,000-pound bombs, even though they had in their possession more targeted bombs. There's reporting that, after they ran out of well-established high-value target lists, they just started. Netanyahu demanded there be more targets and started just demanding that even if there wasn't at all good intelligence that there was a terrorist there, they just keep moving down the list. They have guidelines that are far out of line of how Americans fight wars, that for a senior Hamas militant, they are willing to kill 100 civilians, and for a junior one, I think 20. When we fought in Mosul, it was much lower than that. We tolerate a much lower combatant to civilian death ratio than Israel does. There has been a bunch of misinformation about this that's been going around that both just falsely represent like what happened in Mosul and what happened in other areas. Coleman Hughes has been a major perpetrator of this. It really all comes from a guy named John Spencer who is just wrong. Like there's academics that have like looked at these numbers and he just quotes a number that's wrong. I think he says like the average civilian to combatant death ratio in an urban war is like 8-to-1 or 9-to-1, and it's just not true. It's really about 3-to-1. And that's been debunked like almost a decade ago, I think. So that's a meme that went around for a while. So it's just not true. Things have been particularly indiscriminate in this war, and it's because Israel doesn't care, in my opinion, and because they want to push the civilian population out. They just want them to leave.
If you look at Yemen, it's Muslims killing Muslims, and if you look at Syria, it's Muslims killing Muslims, and if you look at China, it's the Chinese Communist Party putting the Uyghurs into slave or death camps. None of these other conflicts around the world, with the possible exception of Ukraine, Russia at the moment, and just historically speaking, ever gets the kind of attention that Israel being involved in any conflict whatsoever gets.
Yeah.
Do you think there is legitimacy in the quip, no Jews, no news?
That's a difficult question. Like, so I don't want to say that like there's not anti-Semitism in the world, or that there's not problems, or that every single person that talks about this issue is doing it for like perfectly the right reason. I'm sure that there's many that aren't. What I would say is that the Israeli situation is fairly internationally unique, and that also from our Western perspective, many Western countries, most Western countries, but particularly in the United States, support Israel. And in a US context, we fund Israel and provide them their military assets. And that, I think, makes this issue like a lot more important. Like I'll hear so many times like, oh, you'll talk about this bad thing that Israel is doing, but you won't talk about bad things that North Korea is doing. Number one, I'm a libertarian. I talk about bad things North Korea is doing all the time. But number two, we know they're the bad guys. There's no controversy around that. And we don't support, North Korea or Iran or, whatever, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or like whatever country is up to, some bad thing. We do Israel, and we call them the good guys. Not we, but broadly conceived this country. And that's wrong. And so we have to talk about it more. And I also just think this is just such a way of shutting down conversation that I find, I'm not saying you're doing this, you're treating me wonderfully, and this is a great conversation. But I think a lot of people that say that, they are actively being malicious because it's a way of, you're not taking the point seriously. You're not engaging with somebody's points. You're attacking their character for bringing it up and assuming that they must have bad character for talking about this issue. So there's a lot of different reasons somebody might care about this issue more than other issues in other countries. I think just the fact that the US funds it is enough for most people. But for me, I talk about this because I was raised Jewish. I was raised to be a Zionist. I was sent to Israel. I was sent, the school that I was sent to in America, we flew Israeli flags with the United States flag side by side. We took classes that were meant to indoctrinate what's called Ahava Israel, love of Israel in Hebrew, in us. And I learned very clearly that a lot of the things that I was taught, most of the things that I was taught about the history of the country, about what it was doing in the present time, that these were not true. These were either lies or people that honestly believed it, it's frankly probably mostly people that honestly believed it, that were lied to going back generation after generation, and it took on a life of its own, and they believe it. They are not being malicious when they told me things that weren't true, but the community just believes things that aren't true about Israel. And for that reason, I mean, I really feel a special moral responsibility to speak out about this and let people know that a lot of the things that you've heard about this country, they're and what it's doing, they're not true. And that's why I speak out about it, and it's come at great personal consequence. So, you know, I don't want to talk about this issue like because I hate Jews or something. My family is Jewish. You know, I have many problems with Judaism. And I would hope we would share some of those as all atheists here. But that's just not what this is. Like, there's so many different reasons, and I don't like it when people say that. And engage with the arguments. Don't attack the person.
One of the thises that you were talking about that was interesting was that you think that Israel doesn't have respect for property rights, or doesn't, you know, there's various historic reasons, they've stolen land, etc., etc. And so that means they're not fully on board with the Enlightenment, or you wouldn't regard them as great examples of the Enlightenment. Now, I might quibble a little bit with what are the fundamentals of the Enlightenment.
Sure.
I might, for example, say it's our capacity to error correct, that kind of thing, and there are various institutions. And I would certainly hold up individual property rights as being absolutely important, something we want to preserve. But I'd probably put it on similar footing to free expression, free trade, broadly speaking, and democracy. But as I say,
Can I just ask
yes.
you, can you define for me what you mean by ability to error correct there, and what like makes Israel different from other countries in that?
So error correction mechanisms come in various forms. So science is the obvious case where we assume no theory is perfectly true, that if you can do experimental tests, if you have arguments, and in particular if you have a better idea, you can challenge whatever the existing scientific theory is by finding errors within it, correcting them, and going to a better place.
You know, Iran, as is very relevant right now, I don't know when this will release, but there was a war just started 2 days ago. They have a nuclear program. That's science,
Yes.
right? You know, many of these countries do all sorts of scientific work. Now, Islam gets in the way of adopting a fully, you know, scientific and rational ideology. But are you arguing that, you know, just, I understand that Israel is not any kind of theocracy in the conventional sense, but that, you know, I don't see why it's not the case that they don't have equal dogmas, not identical dogmas, but equal dogmas that prevent them from doing that.
So where I was trying to go was to just point out that none of our wonderful democracies that are around the world, Australia, Canada, wherever it happens to be, are perfect instantiations of the Enlightenment. People can point to Australia quite validly and say, you do not have free speech, because we don't. We've got a law called 18C where you can't offend people, among other things. The United Kingdom, a similar thing is going on. People are getting arrested for Facebook posts and so on and so forth. So by that metric, not ideal. However, still worth defending, even though they're imperfect. So we may be able to point to things where we say, don't like the look of Israeli democracy at times, or don't like the look of what might have happened in the past with respect to property rights. But taken as a whole, and rank ordering different instantiations of the Enlightenment around the world, again, as I say, 10 United States, 9 Israel, maybe 8 would be United Kingdom, Australia, we'd probably share that tier. I still think that there is a reason why liberty-loving people would want to support Israel against its enemies, who again, I think are near perfect examples of things, of cultures, of nations that are very anti-liberty. And so we want to take the side of the people who, for all their flaws, seem to me to be more in line with our values.
So let me ask you this. Does that include not allowing the right of return for Palestinians and not, correcting for the violations of property rights that occurred in the past.
In terms of right of return, I think, like with any immigration policy, essentially, we'd want to vet people and to check whether or not they're supportive of the nation to which they move.
So if we can show like clear ties to terrorist activities,
Yes.
We can take that out. For the rest,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
then you would support that.
I would, yes, if we're able to have some sort of security
then
system.
what I'd say is, we're not really that far apart. But what I'd take an issue with kind of the overall thing that you were doing there, is you're turning this into this super low resolution, like taking sides. I'm not on Iran's side, now that the war has broken out or ever, but it's, in this war. I'm not on Iran's side. I'm just not on Israel's side either. And there can be times that you're forced into that, I suppose. But what I'm doing is asking much more finely tuned, higher resolution questions about should this country do X? And if supporting that country means letting it do X, or not criticizing it doing X because, no, I'm on that country's side, I don't think that that's a productive way to think about anything. I mean, that's a very tribal behavior. If you agree that what is happening to the Palestinian people is wrong and want that to stop, that's great. I'm not asking you to hate Israel and be anti-Israel and be against anything that is virtuous in that culture. I'm just saying that, to me, the violations that it is undertaking and has been forever are really, really, really serious issues, and that you should take them seriously and that you should call them out. Because if you're a person that cares about those classical liberal values, you might be able to say, well, Israel practices those more than other countries. I'm not sure I agree with that for the reasons that I laid out. But if you have that opinion, it's not deeply offensive to me. But why then would you want to then allow the imperfectness? You should then, if you care about classical liberalism and you like that, in your view, Israel is more classically liberal than other countries, you should be the first person to be concerned with that they truly honor those values and correct their wrongs, not start excusing them.
Again, there's no perfect Enlightenment nation. And I've got a real allergy to anything that seems to be sliding into any form of moral relativism ever. So the choice is always not between perfect and imperfect, but different degrees of imperfection. And so Australia is an imperfect nation, and I will criticise it till the cows come home about its lack of free speech, for example, its tendency towards socialism at times, etc., etc. However, I would also defend the place with my life, because imperfect though it is, hey, it's a beacon of progress and a beacon for liberty, broadly speaking, even if we could make improvements. And so in the same way, to say that you're not taking Israel's side, but that doesn't mean you're taking Iran's side. I take your point, but does that leave you open to an accusation of moral relativism, that you're not picking a side, when it seems to me like Iran is a theocracy where it used to be a heck of a lot better before the Ayatollahs took over. It wasn't perfect, it was still a tyranny, but hey, at least women were free to wear what they like, let's say.
It sounds like Jake is saying Israel is not sufficiently in the category of an Enlightenment type country at this point.
But it's absolutely not moral relativism. I'm happy to morally judge any action. I'm willing to do that. I don't. It's not like. For it to be moral relativism, I would have to say Iran is good because Israel is bad. I think the reverse is the morally relativistic attitude. I will judge any particular thing that these nations are engaged with and say that is immoral. I don't stand with that. That is moral. I stand with that. But to do this kind of low resolution, just clumping together of everything, and I'm picking a side, I don't think that's morally. I don't think that's moral relativism, I just don't think it's very productive.
Yeah. What I like about this conversation is that, we're not appealing to some, Christian nationalist perspective at all. We're, secular atheists, classical liberals, or fans of the Enlightenment, and we have ways to judge the morality of people all over the world using arguments and reason and evidence. And I just appreciate the quality of that conversation.
Thank you. I do too. Like, this is a lot of fun, and I've been fairly frustrated by the atheist community for, I think, not getting this issue right, because number one, I'm an atheist that came from a Jewish background, and I don't think there's been a full appreciation by atheists of the problem with Judaism and how Judaism factors into this conflict, the messianic ideology that leads to the settlements, but also the idea of Jewish peoplehood that is behind the Zionist project, and the idea that a bunch of atheists from Europe still maintained enough of the religious mindset that they wanted to go move to a place that their religious myth, even though they didn't believe in God per se, told them that was their homeland. And the idea that they were maintaining a separate peoplehood. They didn't go to Palestine to try to be one people with the Palestinians, to learn Arabic and, all share culture and, become one country. They went there to do their own separate thing. That didn't mean they didn't want to be friendly with the Arabs necessarily, but when you create in-group and out-group dynamics, it creates problems. So I wish there was more of a recognition from atheists about all that and how that factors in, because I feel a little bit betrayed as somebody that has tried to call attention to the problems with the Jewish religion, that atheists don't want to pay attention to it in this time. And all the issues about Islam, I overwhelmingly agree with them that atheists point out. I've been making them myself for years, but there's just been such an attachment to that when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so people see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and they see Islam versus Western society, and they don't see that that there's Palestinian Christians and that there was a diverse society there, and that there were property issues that behind this. They don't see the land dispute. They see this like theological conflict that I just think this is not the nail where that is.
Okay, anything to wrap it up, Rick?
Yeah, dynamism, progress, in particular rapid progress, cries out for an explanation. So sitting here in what I would say is the preeminent example on planet Earth of that rapid progress, the United States, we explain it by appealing to things like, hey, you've got a First and Second Amendment, wonderful. You have free speech and the capacity to protect free speech as well. You have free trade, you have capitalism, you have democracy, you can remove rulers. And it seems to me that to the extent that nations and cultures tend in the direction of those things, you have a better society, a more moral society, a society where you simply take the picture on the beach and you see the girls in the bikinis and the gay guys out there and the great diversity of all sorts of people, as well as technological progress, rapid technological progress, improvements in medicine. And I see a lot of that in Israel, which is why I'm still committed to thinking that Israel is a place that is very much worthy of protection and very much worthy of defense, because around it, the explanation for why so many of those cultures have stagnated is because they've tended in the opposite direction, away from free speech, free trade, and democracy.
Cool. All right. Thanks so much, you guys. This is a great conversation. Where can people find you?
WeTheBlackSheep.com, at Joseph Jake Klein on Twitter. Thank you both so much. And I meant to also just add at the end there, like those frustrations are why I'm so glad to be able to have this conversation and like actually talk it through rather than, these internet debates that people have where, you don't actually get anywhere. So I very much appreciate this.
A lot of fun. Great to meet you, Jake.
Cool. So, and Brett, where can people find you?
www.bretthall.org or look up Tokcast, Tokcast.
Yep. This is great. Thank you guys. Keep watching.